Hello, everybody. This is Denise Easton, and I'm delighted to be here, representing Plexus, but also representing this wonderful group of volunteers who make Plexus possible. And we have started last year this wonderful new forum called Pop-Up Conversations, but we have many other events and ways to engage with Plexus to do work. And David has been a long-time friend and contributor and participant in the Plexus network. And so having him here today, sharing some of his journey, but then what he's doing today is just a great gift, and we thank you. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to David, but I am going to have one more comment. Please continue to support and participate and share your ideas in Plexus, because that is what we do. We look at a multitude of different environments and projects and thinking around the application of complexity, and that's where we all learn, and that's how we help hopefully make this world a more viable, sustainable, and open space. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Denise, for the introduction, and hello, Plexus friends. Wow, this is a homecoming for me because I have been connected with Plexus for a really long time. In fact, I was there back at the very beginning when Paul Plesik and Kurt Lindberg and Brenda Zimmerman came together to put together a resource for organizations that was built on this new idea that complexity science might have something to speak into the world of leadership and organizations. And that was back in, it was in the 1990s, might have been 1997 or 1998. That was a long time ago. So Plexus has been instrumental in my career and in my understanding of organizations and how people connect and do the work and organize. And it's just so deep now into my mental models and beliefs. And so I have a lot of gratitude for this community. And this feels really good to bring some of my stories back. So here's what I was thinking. I know this is an open conversation. This is a dialogue. And I thought that perhaps what I might do is spend just a few minutes sharing some perspectives, sharing just a few stories from the work that I'm doing, maybe take 10 minutes or so just to share a little bit. And then I'll open it up to a conversation, and we can just take this wherever we wish. And if you wish, while I am sharing, you're welcome to open up the chat window if there are questions or thoughts that occur to you. If you want to just capture those quickly in the chat window, I won't be looking at that quite yet. Maybe Denise, you can help take a look at that. And then after I've spent a few minutes sharing, maybe the next step will be, let's look at the chat window and see if there's any questions or comments that have emerged. And then from there, we'll just open up to a conversation. Does that work? Good.
Most definitely.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Denise. My work is to help organizations and leaders all around the world to find and then tell their stories. And it's funny, I was just with a group in Germany a few weeks ago, and one of the German guys on the front row, when I said that, he goes, "Really? So that's a job now?" And so, yeah, that is a job now. That is a job. This idea of narrative in organizations. In fact, there's a lot of urgency around it. A lot of people are asking questions about that these days. And a question a lot of people ask me is, how did you get into this work of organizational storytelling? And I think I've been in this work all along. You know, when I look back over my career and the work that I've done, story is always the common element to all of the different roles that I've had. I began my career in advertising. My first job out of college was working in advertising agencies. I was a copywriter for big advertising agencies here in the United States, in Dallas, Texas, and in Atlanta, Georgia. And so there I learned very early that if I tell a story, people will buy more Coca-Cola, right? So, so marketers have known about this for a really long time. You know, this is an old idea in the world of sales and marketing, that when we tell stories, something different happens, that people connect with that in a different way. I know one thing that is special about the Plexus community is that there's a lot of overlap with the organizational learning community. And so if there are any organizational learning people here in our conversation today, you know, my next stop in the world of story and story influence was in organizational learning. I wrote a silly book back in the 1990s called Outlearning the Wolves. And it was a book that introduced principles of organizational learning theory consistent with Peter Senge in the fifth discipline, if you're familiar with that body of work. And it was this silly story with cartoon animals that introduced business theory. And I originally created it as a solution for the Coca-Cola company. Coke was in this journey of organizational learning system-wide. And early in that work of organizational learning, they came across this problem, which was nobody in the organization understood what they were talking about when they said learning organizations or system theory. I mean, it's pretty dense stuff. And so I created this solution to help people understand what is a learning organization. And that crazy book, it ended up being picked up by a publisher, and now it's in a whole bunch of different language. It was unexpected how Outlearning the Wolves caught on. And that was another moment where I said, there's something about this format, that story, that people respond to it differently. I wonder what's going on there and why people have this kind of reaction. So my work in story really goes back even further than that. And I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana. That's where my family still is. And I was raised in a fundamentalist religious movement in the state of Louisiana. And when I say fundamentalist, you know, that their approach to their sacred texts was a literalist approach. And that would produce all kinds of strange behaviors and even some dysfunctional behaviors. And in that system, for example, if you were a person who was divorced, you were going to experience some pain in that system. Or if you were gay, you were going to have a hard time in that system. Even women who had a kind of a leadership gift would encounter some pain and some difficulty in that system. And so growing up as a kid in this organizational religious system, I just remember being confused by it. And the confusion was, these were the most important people in my life. I mean, we went to church all the time, multiple times a week. So these were the central people of my life, and I loved them. And yet I kept having this tense feeling of, when we come together, strange things happen. Things don't work when we come together. These people who I love are hurting each other. I remember one year a member of a congregation who was gay committed suicide. And I was a kid. I didn't have language for making sense of this or interpreting it, but I remember having this feeling that we had something to do with that, you know? And so coming out of that movement of my childhood, what I realized later in my adulthood is my vocation, my organizational work is a response to that experience from my childhood. Because the question I had was, what is it that's happening when good people and well-intentioned people come together and then they start behaving in different ways? What are the structures? What are those invisible things that are driving behavior? I want to see what those things are. I want to understand what those structures are that drive behavior. And so this sent me into my organizational work, and my work began early looking at organizational systems and structures, you know, trying to understand this behavior piece. I did a lot of work early, you know, looking at incentive systems and reward systems. You know, those things, those drive behavior, right? I found out that I wasn't really good at that kind of work. I didn't enjoy that kind of work. And then I moved on to organizational learning. Let's look at organizational systems. What are the mental models? What are the beliefs in an organization that are dictating and guiding action? And then my work evolved even further beyond that. And ultimately, I landed on this idea of stories. What are the stories that we're telling ourselves about ourselves? What are the stories we're telling ourselves about who we are and what we do and why we do what we do? And how are those stories driving behavior? And is there the possibility that by finding new stories or by interpreting stories differently or changing stories, that we can get different behaviors in the organization? And so, when I was younger, I went through a period where I had anger towards the church, and I actually have some gratitude now. It gave me this gift of this vocation. And so now my work in the world is to find the stories and to tell the stories, and then to find new possibilities from the stories that we're telling. And so that takes a lot of forms, and we can talk about that today. That looks like work that I do within big companies, helping senior leaders find and tell their stories. I have learning programs around this, 1-day learning programs, 3-day learning programs, where it looks like sitting in circles and telling stories to each other, and then having conversations about what those stories mean. Recently, I've become part of another initiative that I'm really excited about. I developed this with some colleagues of mine. It's an initiative that we call Story the Future. You can go to storythefuture.com. And this is an international online forum where we are looking at the role of story for deep system transformation. And so there's a lot of resources that are free, that you can access completely for free. And then there's a piece that if you pay for it, you get even more. But hundreds of hours of free content. And so we've talked to people around the world who are changing the narrative around poverty. Mike Love in London is changing the narrative around in Leeds by having people in poverty come forth and share their stories and creating new stories that can create change together. I had a beautiful conversation with Mike Green, who back in the 1980s introduced the AIDS quilt, which was a moment of transition in the narrative around AIDS and HIV. And what Mike said was do you remember the AIDS quilt? They rolled it out on the mall, the National Mall in Washington, D.C. It was thousands of squares, knitted mostly by giving mothers. Mike said he met these mothers, and most of them had lied to their church groups about why their sons were dead. And creating these squares for this massive quilt was their only opportunity to tell the story. And this was a moment of transformation in that dialogue. So at Story the Future, we're looking at what is the role of story in the deep system transformation. It's been really exciting work. And so that's just a glimpse at the work that I'm doing and a little bit of why I'm doing it. And so maybe this is a good place for me to pause, because I don't want this to be a monologue. The fun part of Plexus is the points of connection, the network coming together and new ideas emerging. So Denise, as I've been talking, I haven't been looking at the chat window. Is that a good place to start? Are there some comments or some questions there that we should look at?
I think everybody has been listening very deeply as you've been speaking. So
Okay.
we have any comments, but this is also an opportunity that you can unmute yourself and ask a question, just in the moment, so to speak, or share something. So I invite this as an opportunity to pause, ask a question, and then hopefully David or somebody else will become part of the conversation in the story. So let me mute myself again.
Hi, Nisa. Is anybody else trying to ask a question?
No, okay. It's you, Nisa.
Me. Okay. So, my name is Nisa Sweet. I'm outside of Chicago. I a lot of work in coaching and organizational change. I'm also a writer, so story is a really important part of what I do. And I think part of the reason I signed up for this, I'm trying to get an idea, and I'm saying this after years of working with executives, interviewing people, eliciting their stories, writing presentations and speeches for them, also doing, really deep conversational work. What makes some stories work and some don't? And it's interesting because I was watching some of the CNN town halls with some of the candidates last night, and they all tell stories. Some appear self-serving and don't seem to work to evoke the kind of response they want, and some don't. And I was trying to parse the differences. I mean, was it the number of I statements? Was it the talking about yourself in a way that didn't include other people? So I'm trying to parse this out and wondering what you and others here have that is useful on what you've noticed. What are the stories that when you hear them from someone really get you, and what are the stories that make you sort of roll your eyes and say, oh, he's talking about himself or she?
Thank you, Nisa. And I'm also open to anybody in our circle here jumping in and providing their own insights to the questions that are asked. And that's a rich question, and there's a lot of different ways to come at it. And a traditional way would be to look at story structure. There's a lot of theory around what are the elements that need to go into a story to create engagement. And there's a lot of conversation about stories that have a single protagonist. I've heard. Having a conflict and then a resolution. You've probably seen these different kinds of story structures, star, situation, trouble, action, result. There's lots of structures like that say the more you bring these elements in, the more that you're going to create this engagement, because at a really deep level, story is the operating system that our brains use to make sense of the world. And so when you bring in these story elements at a primal level, we're interested in these elements. And so there's a whole rich conversation there. And so I'm not going to go there. I don't want to talk about how to tell a good story. Because as you were asking that question, Nisa, the thing that I started thinking about is that I've had a similar experience, and especially in political discourse, which right now is poisoning the well of storytelling. I think it's making it hard to have conversations about this. But I keep having this experience as well. Sometimes I'll hear leaders tell really classically well-constructed stories, and I'm not connecting, and I'm thinking, I don't think so. And I think that there are two narratives in the organization, and one is I call it the espoused narrative. These are the stories that we tell with our words. I mean, I just told you a story about myself, right? I grew up in New Orleans, and let me tell you about my church. And so I was saying it with my words. And then the second story is the experienced story. I remember in the old days of Plexus, we used to talk about the shadow system. And this is the story that we're all experiencing. We experience it in our bodies. It's a somatic awareness, a somatic intelligence. And so as I'm listening to a leader tell the espoused story, I'm holding that up to my experience story. When you tell a story, I'm listening to you, and somewhere in my body, I'm going, is this person for real? Does this feel right to me? Or if I'm in an organization where there's low trust and the organization is talking about trust, all right, I hear what you're saying, leader, but what I'm feeling, the story I'm living, doesn't match the story that you're telling. And so there's a lot of talk these days about authenticity. And I think this is an authenticity conversation, where authenticity is what happens when the espoused story and my experience story line up. If you're telling me a story and I'm going, yeah, that feels right to me, then I'm listening and I'm engaged in what you're saying. But if there's a distance between the story you're telling and I'm going, that's not what I'm feeling at all, my world feels very different, then the response can be in an organization, the response can be anxiety, or even anger. In political discourse, the response between the spun story and the felt story is a rage response. So that is one way of thinking about why are there some stories that I connect with and others that I don't. I'll pause there. Others, other thoughts on that?
I'll jump in.
Hey, Lenny.
I just thought it was a great question, Nisa, and what it brought up for me, just kind of spontaneously, is this feeling that I've had for a long time, like most of my life. At certain times, I get goosebumps. Sometimes it's in a movie. Sometimes it's, listening to a friend. I mean, it's random. It's random. And I think it's usually attached to a story being told. And I think that I just came up with this theory on the spot that maybe there's this this hierarchy of benefit that's kind of floating around all the time. And what I mean is that certain stories, you get it. You hear through the words that what they're talking about is good for the tribe, or it's good for the community, or it's good for humanity, or I mean, there's kind of levels of it, and just it's not about the words as much as it is about there's just feelings that are invoked when people say things. And for me, I think that it's almost subconscious or unconscious, that I'm experiencing something that's really deep, that's coming from someone that's connected to all kinds of aquifers and, connections underground between people and history and all these. So that, I don't know, I think I'm rambling now, but this is where I went with your question, that there's connections to things that we don't even understand that are happening inside of the storytelling.
David?
Yes, Brooke.
I have a question based on what you said and the authenticity piece of it. If I play it back wrong, correct me, but it was about matching of what's espoused and what's felt or experienced. Is that correct?
Yes.
So how then I go to, how do we reconcile the experience of one person listening to the story from a different person listening to the story, and their experiences might be different, but to the person telling the story, they really are being authentic and true to what they've experienced. How do we reconcile that, especially in an organization?
Mm-hmm. And this is why in the work that I do, we spend most of our energy and efforts on the meaning-making piece. And it's funny, people hire me for storytelling. We want our leaders to tell better stories. And to me, that's the least interesting part of the work, because once I've told a story, which can indeed be a rich experience and a goosebump creating experience, especially if I've connected to something really deep and true and real, the aquifers that Lenny discussed. The next question is, what happens after that? Because the story is never the end of a conversation. The story is always the beginning of the conversation. And so the conversation that we have after the story is told is really important. Last year, a colleague of mine and I wrote a blog on LinkedIn where we talked about the evolving dialogue around story. And so where most leaders start with storytelling, we drew it as like three concentric circles that most leaders start with story for influence. And as a guy who's trying to build a business, those are the calls I get most often, right? Hey, if I tell a story, I can get people to do something. That's where I started with advertising. If I tell a story, I can sell more stuff. Well, yes, you can. And then there's more to it than that, because then the next circle out and this is an opportunity that I think leaders are missing, is story for sense making and story for meaning making. So after I tell the story, that story is loaded with information. You know, there's data and there's emotion and there's assumptions and beliefs and conclusions and mental models, and all of this rich content, deep content in the sufficient little container that is a story. Well, after we tell it, we need to do something with that. We need to open that up. We need to talk about what was in that story. And so to me, that's the next missed opportunity of story work, is the meaning making piece. And then there's a piece even beyond that. You know, within meaning making, there's a lot of great work happening in knowledge management. And Dave Snowden is doing some brilliant work in that area. And even beyond that, the next missed opportunity is story for what we call healing and holing. And that's my friend Mary Alice Arthur's that I took from her, holing, making whole. This is what we're exploring at Story of the Future. When we tell stories, it reconnects the pieces. It can bring integrity back to the system. And what does that look like? And so, Brooke, to me, the opportunity is to step beyond story for influence, where I just tell you what I think, and I'm hoping that the people will get aligned and now move forward together. To no, what do we know? What does the organization know? What are the stories we're telling ourselves about ourselves? What does it mean? What does it mean to you? What's the new meaning that comes out of this dialogue that we're now having together? And then how can we host this dialogue even more broadly so that we start bringing the pieces of the system back together in a way that creates wholeness? So if somebody, in your original question, Brooke, was, what if somebody in the audience is saying, I experienced that story differently? Well, that happens all the time. They are experiencing it differently. And so we open up the space so that they get to bring that and tell their stories. And then say, I heard something in what you said. Here's the meaning I connected to that. What's the meaning you connected to it? What's a new possibility? I'll pause there.
My name is Mark Narcus Kramer, and I resonate a lot with what you're saying. In fact, we have a project in Plexus about storytelling with about 10 people. But before I get into that, I want to talk about my own experience, which is that in some sense, storytelling touches people in a way that lists or speeches don't do. So we had a company that had a very strong set of values, and managers would often talk about those as like a list. We're about integrity, we're about this, we're about modernizing the air traffic control system, et cetera. And I used to go down at lunch and sit down with some new people, and I would tell a story about how we affected something in a really strong way, which represented the values. And I could just see people's excitement. And I sensed that they felt connected to a larger entity than just themselves. They felt connected to this organization in a way that motivated their ability to want to do better and wanted to operate in a way that had more integrity. So I think there is a meaning part to it, but there's also a part of connection, of connecting to a whole that they honestly believe in. So I want to now make a pitch for our project, and I'm going to put my email on the chat. And if anybody wants to do this, we have about 12 people who are writing stories. And the stories basically are, they start out with the story. A story generally is about an organization that's gone through change and how that operated and what were the values and what were the people's experience. It's generally an I story. I was part of this. And then at the end, we sort of link it to complexity ideas. So instead of saying, well, here are 10 complexity ideas, and just talking about those in theoretical and model terms, we we talk about them as related to the story that we told. So the first story is on the website, Plexus website. So if you want to read it, that's great. I'm going to put my email in and on the chat. And if anybody wants to write a story to be part of this team, because Plexus is making this now a feature of its applied purpose. Plexus is wanting to apply complexity thinking ideas to solving real problems and dealing with complex systems. And stories is a central piece of this. So I will put my email on it. And if anybody wants to join this group and write their own story, we are going to have maybe 8 or 10 stories right now, and we might grow them, and then we might do Plexus meetings on these stories, and we might also do podcasts. And then if somehow it's very rich and we want to go further, we might make a book out of it. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to do a little advertisement for Plexus.
And can you put the link in the chat window so that we can go take a look?
Okay.
Marvelous. Thank you. Yeah, we agree. We have to tell those stories, and because the stories have the emotional content in them, they have the people content. And you know, one of the organizations I'm working with right now is one of the biggest technology consulting firms in the world. And they're having this conversation. They're not good at telling these stories. And so what's happening to them increasingly is they're going into these sales pitches where they'll go up against, you know, McKinsey or Deloitte. This will be for a $1 billion piece of business. And increasingly their customers are saying to them, you know, listen, we already know what the solution you're about to sell to us, because your competitor was just in here. We know you're going to say something pretty similar. And what we want to know is who are you? What do you care about? Make us believe in who you are. And my colleagues in this organization are saying, we don't even know how to have that conversation. What does that mean? Make you believe. We've always won by selling solutions. Now there's this new conversation of belief where we need to bring our values to you. And they're saying that story is central to that. We don't have this capability of telling these stories that reveal who we are and what we value. So in the work that I do with leaders, we usually will begin with the values stories. You know, your organization has the statement of values, and it probably says something in there about quality or excellence or people are our greatest asset. And that's fine. But some of them are kind of samey sounding. But the question is, when we say excellence at our organization, what does that look like here? What's unique about how we do excellence? When we do excellence, it doesn't look like how anybody else does it. Let me tell you what it looks like. And then you have to tell that story. And now you've breathed life into this abstract idea that's quality or excellence. And now it's animated, and now it's a differentiator. So these how stories of who we are, how we do, what we care about, are really important to tell. And a lot of leaders I meet are missing the opportunities to tell those stories. Barb.
Hi. So I see that Denise posted something about a project that she, Amanda Lyons, and I are working on, the Awarefulness Project. And it links to what you were talking about with somatic awareness, somatic listening. And I actually think that there's a layer of connection and story that is beneath any possible language. And that as you're making a collective story of who you are, it precedes language. It's so deeply ingrained in the reality, there is no language. But that you collect it as a group. through this somatic awareness, and then you can give rise to language. So it's very interesting that we have been working below and before the level of story in creating group trust and group awareness. And I see that now that we've got people doing this, that the next phase for us will be asking them, we create some group story and we create ambiguity so that the story in the group can evolve as they are working, but there's a reality that they've agreed to and a way of thinking about things that they've already agreed to. But listening to you, I'm sensing that I need to have them come a little bit more forward with their actual language as they develop their stories. The trust and the story is so deep that in many ways they've already created it, therefore they've moved on. And I think we should slow them down in that verbalization of what they are doing now, and they can then go back and restate it as their story evolves. That's a little inarticulate because we've been working so deep at that somatic level.
I would be interested in learning from you, Barb, because this is kind of where my learning edge is right now as well, is that deeper somatic listening. My colleague, Mary Alice, whenever we go to a new location to do some work, she always researches the history. And she wants to know what's in the land. What is the earth even holding? And she wants that awareness because that's speaking into what's happening in the room, perhaps in ways that we can't articulate or sense overtly. And so she has a very sensitive awareness about that. And so that somatic awareness, Barb, is something that I'm very interested in as well. And so as you pursue this, I'd be curious to access that dialogue.
Yeah, we'll keep in touch. I've seen Mary Alice work, and I didn't know that she does that research. She was just facilitating a conference I was at. But yeah, the knowledge is in the land, it's in the body. I mean, I've noticed on the East Coast that our place names are all indigenous, which means people were there to name. And then you go out west and it's all English language or Spanish language, which means that people were not there to name. And it's just an extraordinary thing that you don't think about. But, you know, Washington, D.C. is on the Potomac River. Nice Indian name.
Mm-hmm. You know, no, whoever,
that was Nisa.
That was, go ahead.
Is there a hand-raising thing on this? I don't know. I was looking for one to say, hi, I want to raise my hand and say something. So I just wanted to offer something, and it hits to sort of this search for this, what is the somatic stuff? So in many ways I come out of an NLP world as well as sort of a neuroscience study world. And so there's an NLP concept called congruence. And there are also NLP concepts around how do we calibrate what we're doing with our body so that what we see, what we hear, what we experience. The sort of bottom line on this is that I can actually model, who I think is really effective and inspiring, and I can in some ways model, which means almost like make a spreadsheet, what are doing with their eyes, with their hands, with their whatever, that leads to this sort of belief. And the ultimate expression of that, which comes out unconsciously, is if my ideas and my body agree with each other. And there have been studies done on the most effective leaders are the most congruent. You know, the other side of this is you can model it and learn it, and fake it. And I don't know if it matters, because at the same time you're faking it, you're also embodying, making it real. But in this, I don't think it's just the story. It's how does the story react with our senses and with the storyteller's senses. And we sort of know from neuroscience now that there are God, I can't remember the name of it, but there's a mechanism in our brains which makes us mimic the person that we're listening to. So if I'm telling you a story of an experience I had running from a fire, you're experiencing that same thing and having some of those same physical reactions. And if I put you in a scanner, some of the same parts of your brain are going to light up. So I'm sort of in the search of how do we deepen these things? How do we teach them? And, if I think of that scale that goes from unconscious incompetence to unconscious competence, we bring people through those stages on all this.
Yeah. I'm interested in that sensitivity too. And what you described, the term for that would be neural coupling, right? That's
thank you.
The listener's brain changes to match the shape of the teller's brain.
Exactly.
Very powerful connection when that happens. Somebody else was speaking and I interrupted.
No, it's also mirror neurons. That's the other word. Yeah.
Mirror neurons. Yes.
Yeah.
David, I'm curious, as you help people draw out the stories, I'm curious as to what works best for you in helping people draw out stories and making sense out of them to make them useful and actually authentic.
So I heard two things. One is how do you draw out stories, and then the other is how do you draw sense from the stories, right?
Okay. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, because those are two different things. One is how do you ask people to tell stories? Because there is a paradox to this work where stories are ubiquitous, and when we sit down to the dinner table, we're going to start telling stories to our loved ones about what happened today. Nobody has to tell you, hey, if you would use narrative over the dinner table, it would create bonds of connection. And I mean, no one says that. We just do it naturally. And yet bringing it into the organization, something changes. It's harder to do in the organization. So this thing that's ubiquitous is also very fragile. And so inviting stories in the organization is something that you have to be mindful of. And we spend a lot of time talking about that. And part of it can be as simple as being overt and saying, when we tell stories, something different happens. When we tell stories, it creates a different kind of connection. And I'd like for us to experience that. Sometimes if I'm with a science organization, I'll even show the neural coupling that Nisa was describing. I have slides that here's a EEG here's what a brain-on story looks like. And scientists go, oh, that's fascinating. Okay, well, let's experience that. So some people want the data even. But calling attention to the phenomenon is one way of validating that, we're going to connect with one another today in a different way. So that's one way of doing it. There's also a lot of work around language. What's the language that we use when we ask somebody to tell a story? I've got, this is my book, Circle of the Nine Muses. There's even an entire chapter in here around story elicitation. What's the language that invites people into a narrative space? And then what's the language that will kind of put the lid on the narrative space? And it's not that difficult. We just have to be mindful of it. So there's a lot of ideas around that. And then, Brooke, the other piece of story meaning making, how do we invite people to draw meaning out of the story? There's a lot of sense making kinds of frameworks around that. It's a really deep body of thought. It's epistemology. It's how do we create knowledge? How do we use our language to create our understanding of the world? I have some simple frameworks that I'll use with a group. One comes from my friend Paul Costello in Washington, D.C., who does a lot of work with young leaders in Israel and Palestine. His company is called New Story Leadership. And his framework is, he says there's a geography of meaning. There's meaning to be found behind the text, within the text, and then in front of the text. When I say the text, that's just the story that we tell. So behind the text is, what am I noticing about you, the teller? Or what am I noticing about me, the listener? What am I noticing about all of us as we listen to you tell your story? So we're talking about the phenomenon of the story space without even talking about the story yet. Then there's meaning to be found inside the text. when you told your story, that I heard something really interesting in that. You said the word trust about 4 times in your story. I think that was really a story about trust. The storyteller might go, "Oh, really? It was? Oh, yeah. Now that you say that, that kind of makes sense." So now I'm using my language and I'm adding meaning to what I heard inside your story. Then there's meaning to be found in front of the text. This is starting to turn into the actionable wisdom. I heard a behavior in your story where I wish other people on our team would make decisions the way you made decisions. Think how powerful we would be if everyone had the kind of resilience that you showed in that story. So now we're drawing out meaning that can actually carry us into the future. So that's one framework, the geography of meaning, behind, within, and in front. There's many, many others. I like that one for simplicity. When I present that to a group, they go, "Oh, that makes sense. Oh, let's give that a try. Let's have a conversation about a story we just heard." And then it ends up being this really rich, deep dialogue of meaning making. And meaning making is one of those terms that sounds really academic, but once people engage in the process, they find out that it's really happening all the time. Our brains are meaning making machines. If I put several pieces of data together, your brain is going to start trying to construct a narrative that will connect those data points, whether they belong together or not. The great book on this is Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. He shows how our need to create meaning and assign meaning to data points actually gets us into trouble. It's what drives unpredictability in financial markets. He won a Nobel Prize for demonstrating that. So this meaning making piece, there's lots of frameworks around it, but once you invite people into the conversation, they're usually surprised to find how quickly they're able to access this meaning making dialogue and how much they want to contribute to that conversation. I'll pause again.
This is Jennifer Bloom. And I do public health work with organizations in Texas, and I also write poetry, and and I find that the story pervades all of it. Whether a program evaluation is a story, and a poem is a story, and something you were talking about the meaning making and sort of the story for healing made me think of some work I've done using my poetry in a workshop setting where there 6 or 8 people, and there's a bunch of poems on the table kind of upside down, and everyone picks a poem at random, and the writing prompt is why did this poem choose me today? Or if we're talking about gratitude, it's what does this poem have to show me about gratitude? And then they free write for about 10 minutes, and then they'll read the poem back. Each participant will read the poem back in their own voice, and so it's sort of like they'll tell and everybody inevitably creates their own story around what that poem evoked for them, around whether it's a theme or just general what they're working with, and then as a group we create this collective story that started with these stories that were strictly from my perspective, but then bringing in each person's perspective, and then layering everybody kind of it starts the conversation. And what's fascinating for me as someone who writes my story is how when I share my story and invite people to bring their story to that, how that creates this really rich sense of connection, often among strangers who are meeting for the first time. And even when people are it's a group of people who've worked together or something like that, but it creates this sense of when someone was talking about the somatic experience and it's there's something about it that allows people to connect in a way that's really meaningful, and to build a collective story that's really meaningful.
Wow, Jennifer, that sounds lovely. I'd love to see that play out. And you're right. People, that connection that you describe, people will describe that using terms like profound.
Mhm.
I've heard people say, hey, this guy sitting next to me who I just told a story with, and I heard his story. I've been working with this guy for 10 years, and I feel like I learned more about him in 5 minutes than I learned in the previous 10 years. Well, that's interesting. I mean, how is that realistically possible? And yet people have this profound experience of connection where, because of the story, now I know you. And that's why people who do a lot of high conflict work, including my colleague Paul Costello with New Story Leadership, will begin with story. You know, when we tell stories now, our differences pale in comparison to this profound neural coupling sense of connection that we just had with one another. As I'm speaking, I see different faces popping up on the screen, and I've just noticed that 2 of my beloved colleagues, Thaler Picard and Madeline Blair, are both on this conversation. They have been doing rich work in narrative practice for a long time. And I am delighted that they're here. I hope that you'll reach out and explore their work as well. Thaler and Madeline, be sure to put your web addresses in the chat window so people can see the work you're doing. And I hope you'll feel free to jump in with some insights and ideas of your own. We could easily do this pop-up call with Thaler or Madeline. Their work is so great. So welcome, friends. I'm glad you're here. Others. Thank you, Madeline.
Hi, Tom Sparrow here.
Tom is here. Hey, Tom.
Hey.
Another great practitioner.
It is really wonderful to be part of this conversation. And I was thinking about the question of getting people to elicit their stories and how to find them. And also kind of tying in with Nisa's original question about what makes a story work and another story not work. And I think they're tied together for me. And also the neural coupling that we're talking about, which is that for me, effective stories are experiences that we're sharing. And so if we have a question like, tell me about a time when you felt disconnected and then found yourself connected, or a time when you were overly busy and things went awry. But if we get our story to be a specific moment that we're sharing, and then we relive that moment as we share it, that provides the mechanism, the starting mechanism that we need for the neural coupling so that the teller and the listener are connected. And if the teller isn't connected to that experience, they're going to be missing it. The listener is not going to have it if the teller doesn't. And one little example of this, I am a church-going person, and as scripture is read, there are people who say the words eloquently, but you can tell they're not connected to what the text is actually saying. And then there's other people, who read scripture and they enter into it in a more full way. And you can see that in their body, and it brings us right along. So I think that sharing of experience and entering into it, starting as the teller, is one of the keys to this connection that we're talking about today.
Lovely. Thank you, Tom. This language of tell me about a time, people who do story work, that's kind of classic language. That is, back to the question of how do you get people to tell a story? That's good language to use. Tell me about a time when you saw your team demonstrate resilience. I mean, or whatever the topic is. But when we say tell me about a time, now we've invited people to search their historical database. They're looking backwards in time over their experiences. Tell me about a time. Well, there was that time when we were working with that really tough client in Atlanta, and actually here's what happened. So tell me about a time is good language that will draw people into narrative space. Another little trick that well, not a trick, but that I like to use to bring people even deeper into the story is bring in some emotional language. It's not just tell me about a time you saw the team show resilience, but tell me about a time you saw the team show resilience in a way that inspired you. Well, as soon as you say that, now people are searching their memories in a different way. As soon as I say the word inspired, well, you know what that feels like to be inspired. And somewhere in your body, you evoke that feeling of being inspired. When was I inspired by my team? It wasn't the Atlanta deal. Actually, it was a time when we really came together. And here's what happened. And so now people are searching their memories in an emotional way, which is actually richer. There's research that says that the reason we have emotion is because we're using it to sort our memories. The time that we felt something, that's our body. I've heard it called somatic marker theory. Somatic marker. The emotion is putting a stamp on a memory. Bam, remember this. This is important. So when we bring in that emotional language, we get those richer, deeper, more meaningful stories. So there's a couple ideas to think about as you reflect on, if I want my team to tell me stories, what are some ways I might do that? Tell me about a time, and then bring in an emotional word as well.
So David, could I just build on that for a sec?
Please.
So a couple of times, especially in a company where people have gone through way too many behavioral interviews, tell me about a time sometimes puts people into sort of a fight or flight. I can't think of an example. So a couple of things I've used is like first to sort of model it and tell my own story, which sometimes helps evoke a story in them a little bit. I've also used timelines where people have physically walked back and forth between 5 years ago and today or whatever. And something, looking for resilience. So as you walk along this timeline, think of all the things you're experiencing. When you get to a point, something about resilience, sort of stop. And even just, one of the things I learned from David Rock is there's a difference between how your brain processes a command versus a question. So something like tell me sometimes can be perceived as that command that puts you into fight or flight. But, I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind, or could I ask you to, and just by asking somebody a question brings them into the endeavor. So just a few more things to add to what you said.
Beautiful. Nisa, I even use the language, I invite you to tell about a time when, and there's something about invitation that's welcoming. People like to be invited to something. There's choice there.
Yeah.
It's not a command. And so I love that, Nisa, because this language sensitivity that you're describing, I spend a lot of time thinking about that. If there is going to be an occasion where we're bringing people to tell stories, I and my colleagues will spend a lot of time looking at what are the words we're using, what's the story we're asking for. And we get very nuanced in our use of language.
So
I'd like to.
One of the pitfalls that I found in working with this story project is that highly educated people generally are attaching themselves to certain theories or ideas. And instead of telling the story, they really want to talk about their models, and they want to talk about their research and ideas. And so what I find happening is oftentimes the story's kind of built around trying to prove something. And that sort of makes the story very brittle. Rather than sort of telling the story and hoping that the reader will, or listener will, begin to relate to what they're trying to get at.
Yeah, I've experienced that as well. And this might be a place, is it Marcus?
Mark.
this might be a place where, for me, I noticed that espoused story versus the experience story. A lot of people in the audience can feel it when the person is using a story to justify an agenda or to promote a conclusion that they've already come to.
Yeah, and that doesn't quite work.
It doesn't quite work. No. And if the teller is self-aware and sensitive, they'll come to that awareness, right? The audience wasn't with me on that.
Yeah, the other thing I found is it's interesting to get people to be vulnerable in a story. So stories don't usually have, we did this and we all lived happily ever after. Or we did this and look how great I was in doing that. So we encourage people to talk about their own vulnerabilities and their, where they felt short, or where they were anxious, or where they were. So it brings in a human aspect of the story rather than it was terrible, I did great things, the organization did great things, and we lived happily ever after. It just doesn't seem to work either.
I'd like to add, I'm Mark's team, and I'll say Mark's doing a great job of nudging us in the direction of being more transparent. And so thank you for the work you're doing, Mark.
Thank you.
And in talking about language, that's something that's fascinating to me, and especially in how words actually invoke oftentimes emotions that you're not intending for them to. Can you speak to anything about how people perceive or respond to specifically words around freedom? I find that to be a very triggering word, especially in organizations, because you've got so many underlying, whether it be manipulation or whether it be control or whether it be, dissonance. I find that, that's the one thing that they need, but how do you frame that in a way that people don't, move into this fight or flight reaction?
I'd love to hear more about that, Susan, but my first response might be, what if we simply invited people to tell their stories about a time that they experienced freedom? And then listen for what comes out of the stories. And there may be some aspirational or beautiful associations with freedom, and we may also encounter some pain or some toxicity or some dysfunction. And that becomes part of the process. Wow, there's a lot here in the team that I didn't realize was here, and it just came up in this storytelling experience. I know that I think Madeline has stepped off of the conversation, but Madeline Blair has done work in that. Dave Snowden, Cynthia Kurtz, another colleague of mine, her process is called participatory narrative inquiry. Once we've collected all these stories, that's data. How do we process that? What did we hear? What's happening in the system? How do we collect all the way that we can do something with it? And so go look up Cynthia Kurtz and participatory narrative inquiry. She's got a really lovely process for collective sense making, even at very large scales.
Cynthia Kurtz?
Cynthia Kurtz, Kurtz. Her work is brilliant. I learn a lot from her. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Wow, I lost track of the time. I just saw a text from Denise saying we've gone over. Denise, what should happen next? Where are we?
Well, as many of you who have been on Plexus pop-up conversations, nobody ever wants to leave. But I am very I'm very respectful, or we all are very respectful of everybody else's time. So I invite at this point in time any sort of final questions or comments. But what has clearly been demonstrated is that we hope that you'll come back, David. And there's a lot of work happening in Plexus around sense making and storytelling. And yes, Cynthia is terrific. And there's a Plexus catalyst, Bruce Waltuck, who knows Cynthia very well. We've had a number of conversations, and so some work is emerging in that area, which will be really, I think, really exciting. So I have a feeling this is just surfaced once again, the energy that's happening within the group. And I really do invite everybody to consider sharing their story, or emerging story with the whole group, because it's really important. This is how we build these connections. And so any final questions? And then David, I will let you wrap it up. And yes, Barb and I will be talking to you about awarefulness, because it's very exciting. And I've written about 14 pages of notes.
Beautiful. So Denise, did you ask for final questions?
I'm asking for final questions.
Okay.
Comments?
Or thoughts? Yeah, observations. There's a lot of wisdom in this circle. So I think we're approaching lunchtime for people here in the United States. Thank you, Plexus, for this opportunity to step back into the circle. My journeys have taken me away from the Plexus tribe just a little bit over the past few years. And yet this is always a place that feels like home when I come back. And as I shared at the beginning, I have a lot of gratitude for this community and the learning that has come from this community. This feels good to be back in the circle. Thank you for hosting me. Thank you for your questions and your wisdom. And I look forward to the next time that we get to connect. And I hope that you will live a great story until that time.
Hey, David, if you could look at if you have time to look at some of our stories that we're putting on the website, Plexus website, and give me your feeling about them, I really appreciate it.
I'm all over it, Mark. I'm happy to.
Thank you.
Thank you.